Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mrs. Detective. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way into this space. Around here, we do things differently. We don't just talk about crime, we talk about people. People with dreams, with families, with complicated stories. And the case we're talking about today, it's one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. You've probably heard the name, the Black Dahlia. But behind that haunting nickname was a real young woman, Elizabeth Short. This case has been retold so many times and often not with the care it deserves. So today I want to invite you to hear it differently, not just as a mystery, but as a life interrupted. But before we begin, I want to share a quick disclaimer. This episode does contain some disturbing content, including violence and graphic descriptions related to a real murder. Please listen with discretion, especially if those topics are difficult or triggering for you. My goal, as always, is to honor the victim, share facts responsibly, and tell the story with empathy and respect. Some of what we'll explore today is based on public records and credible reporting, while other parts involve theories and speculation that remain unresolved. I'll be your guide, but this is your space. Take care of yourself as you listen. All right, let's begin. Today's story is hard, not just because it's violent or famous or mysterious, but because it's personal. Because behind the gruesome headlines and the crime scene photographs, there was a young woman who was lost long before the world noticed she was gone. Her name was Elizabeth Short, but the press, the police, and the public didn't call her that. They called her the Black Dahlia. And for almost 80 years now, her name has been synonymous with one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history. But today, we're not starting with her body in a field. We're not starting with her killer or with the crime scene or with the autopsy. We're starting with her life, with who she was before she became a symbol, because that's what Elizabeth deserves. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe May Short. Now, like many families in the 1920s and 30s, the Shorts weren't rich. They were working class, modest. But they got by. Her father built miniature golf courses, oddly enough, a booming business during the early years of the Depression. And for a little while, things seemed okay. Until 1930. That's when everything began to unravel. Elizabeth was just 6 years old when her father, Cleo, vanished. One day, his car was found abandoned on a bridge, and authorities assumed he had taken his own life. There was no note, no warning, just a disappearance. And with 5 daughters to care for, her mother, Phoebe, was suddenly on her own. They moved into a smaller home in Medford, Massachusetts. Phoebe worked long days as a bookkeeper to support the family. Elizabeth's health wasn't great. She suffered from chronic bronchitis and even had surgery at one point. Doctors eventually told her family that she'd do better in a warmer climate. So every winter, she'd travel down to Miami and stay with family friends. I think this is where you start to see the formation of someone who becomes, in many ways, rootless, not lost, but always looking for the next thing. The next place, a better situation, something different. Elizabeth was striking. Pale skin, deep-set eyes, jet black hair. People noticed her. They remembered her. In photos, she's got this classic Hollywood look. Soft curls, a little bit of mystery in her expression. You could see why someone would think she belonged on a screen. And she thought that too. She never finished high school. She bounced between jobs. Waitressing, working the counter at a movie theater. And then in 1942, 2 things happened. First, she moved to California to live with her father. And second, she got arrested. Now, this part of her life is really misunderstood. She was arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking at a bar. She was 18. And yeah, the mugshot that came from that arrest, that photo became part of the Black Dahlia myth. But what you rarely hear is that she wasn't charged. She was sent back to Massachusetts and told not to come back unless she was with her father. She didn't stay away for long. California had a pull. And not just because of the sunshine. This was wartime America, the early 1940s, and in Los Angeles there was glamour and grit, and the lines between them were getting blurry. Hollywood was booming. Studios were desperate for fresh faces. Soldiers were everywhere, and young women like Elizabeth were showing up in droves, hoping to get discovered. She didn't have much money. She relied on friends, flings, and favors. She dated military men, moved from couch to couch. Sometimes she worked, sometimes she didn't. Some people described her as flighty, others called her sweet. Some said she was a compulsive liar, always spinning stories about movie roles or modeling gigs that never existed. But I think she was just a young woman trying to survive in a place that promised everything and gave almost nothing. In her letters, she comes across as sincere, a little dramatic maybe, but kind. She wrote to men she'd dated. She asked about their families. She told them she missed them. She was, in many ways, emotionally hungry and very alone. By late 1946, she was back in Los Angeles. And that's where things start to move toward the part of the story everyone knows. On January 9th, 1947, Elizabeth was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. She told the staff she was waiting for her sister. No one knows if that was true. It's the last confirmed sighting of her alive. 6 days later, on January 15th, a woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter through a quiet neighborhood called Leimert Park. It was mid-morning, bright, clear skies, and that's when she saw the body. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, a store display that had been dumped. It was too pale, too perfect. But as she got closer, she realized the truth. It was a woman. A young woman, naked, severed at the waist. Her arms raised above her head. Her body posed. There was no blood. None. Her face had been sliced from ear to ear in what's known as a Glasgow smile. She had bruises, cuts, and deep lacerations across her thighs and chest. Her intestines had been removed and tucked beneath her lower back, and her lower half was placed a few inches away, angled, almost displayed. She'd been completely drained of blood. Her hair was clean, her skin scrubbed. The killer had taken their time and then arranged her like a grotesque sculpture. Police were called. The area was roped off. Reporters arrived almost immediately. Some say they got there even before homicide detectives. One photographer climbed a ladder just to get a shot from above. Within hours, the story was out. Body of beautiful girl found mutilated, one headline read. But they didn't know who she was. She had no ID, no purse, no clothes, just a body and a face carved into something unrecognizable. A few days later, her fingerprints were sent to the FBI. At the time, the Bureau had just started using a primitive version of fax technology, something called sound photo, to send prints back and forth across the country. It worked. Elizabeth Short was identified by her fingerprints from that Santa Barbara arrest 4 years earlier. The moment her name was released to the press, the feeding frenzy began. Reporters hounded her family. They tracked down ex-boyfriends. They interviewed landlords, bar owners, waitresses. They printed anything and everything, true or not. On paper, the Los Angeles Examiner even tricked her mother into talking by telling her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest. She didn't know her daughter was dead until after they'd gotten their quotes. It's one of the most disgusting things about this case, the way the media treated Elizabeth, not as a victim, but as a character in some noir fantasy. They called her a vamp, a drifter, a party girl. They said she was promiscuous, that she lured men, that she lived on the edge. There's no real evidence for any of that. She had relationships, yes, but so do most people. What made her different was how brutally she died and how eager the public was to consume every twisted detail. The LAPD launched a massive investigation. They questioned over 150 men in the first month alone. They chased leads across California and beyond, doctors, barbers, butchers, artists, servicemen, Anyone with even a faint connection to Elizabeth was brought in. But they had almost nothing to go on. Then came the letter. On January 24th, 1947, the Los Angeles Examiner received a chilling package. It was a manila envelope addressed in cutout letters like something from a movie ransom note. It had been carefully cleaned with gasoline, just like Elizabeth's body. Inside were some of her personal belongings: her birth certificate, business cards, a social security card, a handwritten address book with pages torn out. There were also photographs, pictures of her smiling with friends, and included in the packet was a note that read, "Here are Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The killer was toying with the media, leaving a breadcrumb trail, or maybe just enjoying the spectacle. The police immediately analyzed the contents, but there were no fingerprints, no DNA testing in those days. The gasoline had erased everything. A few days later, more letters came, all written in that same cut-and-paste ransom style. Some were threats, some were taunts. One said, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Another read, "I have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." And still, nothing that led to a real name. LAPD kept the pressure up. They assigned more than 750 officers to the case. That's how big this was. They interviewed nearly 2,000 people in total. Tips flooded in from all over the country. But the deeper they dug, the more they found confusion, rumors, lies, people who claimed to know Elizabeth but didn't, men who wanted attention, women who just wanted to help. And then there were the confessions. Over 500 people confessed to killing the Black Dahlia. Some were drunks, some were mentally ill, others just wanted their 15 minutes of fame. A few were eerily convincing, knew just enough detail to make detectives pause, but none panned out. There was no physical evidence, no eyewitness, and no clear motive. So who did it? The theories are endless. But among all the possibilities, one name has captured more attention than almost any other: Dr. George Hodel. If you've never heard that name, don't worry. His name didn't come up until decades later. But his story is one of the darkest, strangest threads in this whole mystery. George Hodel was a wealthy, respected physician in Los Angeles. He was also a womanizer, an intellectual, and a man who surrounded himself with the most elite and the most eccentric figures in California's art and bohemian scenes. His home was legendary, a Mayan-style mansion known as the Sowden House, exotic, secretive, full of shadows, and just a few miles from where Elizabeth's body was found. In 2003, Hodel's own son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, published a book accusing his father of killing Elizabeth Short. Steve said that he found photo albums in his father's belongings after his death, and in one of those albums there were pictures of a dark-haired woman who looked exactly like Elizabeth. He dug into old files, court records, and even LAPD surveillance logs, and what he found shocked him. Back in 1950, LAPD had investigated George Hodel. They even bugged his house for several weeks. One of the transcripts from the surveillance allegedly includes this line from George himself: "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." And yes, his secretary had recently died of what the coroner called an accidental overdose. That's not all. George Hodel was a suspect in multiple sexual assault cases. He had been accused of abusing his own daughter. He was known for hosting strange, sexually charged parties at his home. The LAPD never arrested him, never filed charges. Some say it was because of his connections, his wealth, his influence. Steve Hodel believes his father not only killed Elizabeth Short, but that he was a serial killer who operated for years under the radar. Not everyone agrees. Critics say Steve wanted attention, that the photo he claimed was Elizabeth wasn't her at all, that the evidence is circumstantial. But here's the thing. The LAPD has never officially cleared George Hodel, and the district attorney's office, years later, acknowledged that he had been a serious suspect. Whether or not he did it, we may never know. But his story is just one example of how this case has consumed people. People who weren't even alive in 1947 still find themselves pulled into it, obsessed. And I think that says something about how unsolved cases fester, about how justice delayed, especially for a young woman so brutally killed, doesn't really go away. It just echoes. And the press didn't help. The media coverage at the time wasn't just sensational. It was dehumanizing. They called Elizabeth everything from a party girl to a tease. They published photos from her personal life. They dragged her name through the mud, as if somehow she'd earned what happened to her. They almost never printed that she'd written sweet letters to soldiers, or that she wanted to act not for fame, but because she loved storytelling, or that she was estranged from her father and trying to build a life out of scraps. Now, that wouldn't sell papers. And that's something I think about often, that a young woman with no home, no steady job, and no support system could be murdered, cut in half, and still be blamed for her own death. But not here. On this channel, we don't do that. We remember Elizabeth Short as a full person, not a myth, not a headline. And while the investigation continued, so did the whispers. Some said the LAPD bungled the case because they were corrupt. Others said they were protecting someone. In 1949, a grand jury was convened to review the case. They issued a report criticizing the department's lack of coordination, their failure to follow leads, their general mishandling of the media circus. But it didn't change anything. The case went cold. And eventually, the city moved on. But Elizabeth never really left. She became part of the cultural fabric of Los Angeles. Her story was referenced in movies, novels, TV shows, even songs. Her photo, black and white, classic Hollywood glamour, kept circulating. But behind the image was still the same unanswered question. Who killed Elizabeth Short? And why? Over the years, dozens of new suspects have emerged, some through official police leads, others through citizen investigations, amateur sleuths, journalists, and authors chasing the same question, who could have done this? One of those names was Mark Hansen. He was a nightclub owner and a well-connected Hollywood figure. Elizabeth had reportedly stayed at his home for a while, not alone, but with other aspiring actresses. Some accounts say she refused his advances and that he was enraged. Others claim she left his home on good terms. But there was something else. The address book found in the killer's package, it had Mark Hansen's name embossed on the cover. It was his book. Given to her? Taken back? Stolen? Hansen was questioned by police early in the investigation, but never charged. Some believe he had too many friends in high places. Others think he was simply a convenient scapegoat, the kind of man whose lifestyle made him suspicious. Then there was Robert Red Manley, the last confirmed person to see Elizabeth alive. Manley was a traveling salesman, married, but he'd spent a few days with Elizabeth in San Diego. He even drove her back to Los Angeles and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, the last place she was ever seen. He admitted to being with her, but swore he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He passed multiple lie detector tests, and police eventually cleared him. But his name never left the case completely. The strange thing about Red is that he later suffered a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized. Some say it was unrelated, others think guilt was eating at him. We don't know for sure. Another man, Leslie Dillon, is a suspect whose story didn't surface until decades later. Dillon was a bellhop, a writer, and a self-proclaimed crime expert. In 1948, he wrote to the LAPD with his theory about the killer, but investigators quickly became suspicious of him. The more they questioned him, the more inconsistencies showed up in his story. He knew specific details about the crime that hadn't been released. Some believe he may have had inside knowledge. But then it gets murky, because the LAPD tried to arrest him while he was in another state, but the department was blocked by someone high up in the city's power structure. It's never been clear who or why. That alone sparked rumors of a larger cover-up, that Dylan either had a protector or was being used as a scapegoat. In the end, the case grew colder, not because people stopped caring, but because they ran out of road. The files got dusty, leads dried up, detectives retired, witnesses died, and a new generation of investigators moved on to new cases. In the decades that followed, new techniques emerged: DNA testing, advanced forensics, geographic profiling. But none of those tools were able to do what we all hoped they would: close the case. Why? Because the crime scene wasn't preserved properly. Evidence was contaminated. Key people weren't interviewed quickly enough. And some records were lost permanently. Some, possibly, were buried on purpose. One of the biggest frustrations for people who've tried to solve this case isn't what's known, it's what was never documented, what police may have known but didn't write down, what people said at the time but never officially reported. And then there's the theory that maybe, just maybe, the killer was someone so powerful, so untouchable, that they were shielded from the start. Is it a conspiracy theory? Maybe. But is it impossible? Not at all. Los Angeles in the 1940s was not the clean, glamorous Hollywood you see in old postcards. It was corrupt, deeply corrupt. The police were in bed with the mob, journalists were paid to kill stories, detectives were pressured to protect certain people and frame others. So, yes, it's entirely possible that the truth about Elizabeth Short's murder was known and kept quiet. But here's the thing. The longer a case stays unsolved, the harder it becomes to separate fact from theory. Memory fades, witnesses vanish, and we're left with shadows, with secondhand accounts, with rumors. And through all of this, Elizabeth Short becomes not a person, but a story. A haunting one, but still a story. She becomes the Black Dahlia, the nickname that has eclipsed her real name. The name that sells books, that appears in TV shows, that becomes shorthand for horror and glamour and mystery. But who was Elizabeth? She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who loved movies and makeup and jazz, who dreamed of being something more, who wore black because it made her feel beautiful, not because she wanted to become a noir fantasy. And when we focus only on her death, the grotesque crime scene, the shocking violence, we risk losing her entirely. I think about how lonely she must have been in those last days, bouncing between friends' homes, struggling for money, telling stories about auditions that may never have happened, smiling in photographs even when things were falling apart. I wonder if she knew she was in danger, if she saw something coming, if someone betrayed her trust. I wonder how long she suffered, if she was terrified, if she fought back. And those are the thoughts that haunt me more than any headline ever could. There's a reason this case endures. It's not just the brutality, it's not just the mystery. It's the injustice, the silence, the ache of a story without an ending. And yes, there's morbid curiosity. There's the desire to solve a famous case. But for many of us, it's not about catching a killer. It's about giving Elizabeth back her voice. Because she didn't get to speak after January 9th, 1947. She didn't get to explain where she went, who she met, what she feared. And maybe by telling her story now, not as a Jane Doe on a sidewalk, but as a complicated, imperfect, real person, we bring her a little closer to peace. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there knows something they've never said. A name, a detail, a moment, something that seemed small at the time, but means everything now. These cases, they don't really die, they just wait. There's something strange about unsolved stories. They don't end, they echo. And this one, the story of Elizabeth Short, has echoed for decades through tabloid pages, through whispered theories, through television scripts and documentaries and countless books. But here's the question I've sat with. At what point does telling the story stop helping? At what point does it just become repetition, consumption? The Black Dahlia case has been picked apart endlessly, often not with care, but with spectacle. As if she were never a real person, as if her mutilation made her more interesting. I think about the photographs they printed in the newspapers, how raw they were, how sensational. I think about how her family must have felt seeing her legacy become a crime scene headline, a shock story, a brand. And I think that says a lot about the culture of true crime, how we've often been conditioned to focus on the killer, their psyche, their childhood, their skills, their pattern. But here on this channel, here with you, we focus on the victim, always. Elizabeth Short was not the Black Dahlia. She didn't choose that name. She didn't choose that legacy. What she chose, as best as we can tell, was to chase something better. A future that felt impossible where she came from. She wanted love, safety, art, something permanent. And instead, she became famous for her death. And I think one of the best ways we can honor her is to remember what she didn't get. She didn't get to grow up, to tell her own story, to move on, to fall in love and build a life. She was frozen in time, immortalized not in success or family or freedom, but in violence. And it's that violence that we, decades later, still haven't accounted for. I sometimes wonder what would happen if this case had happened today. If Elizabeth had gone missing in 2024, would we have found her killer? Would security footage, cell phone pings, DNA evidence, social media trails, would any of that have saved her or solved the case? Would the police have believed her friends if they said she was scared? Would the media have treated her differently? Or would they still have dragged her past through the mud, dissected her clothes, her relationships, her choices, all in search of someone to blame? I don't know. But I do know that the world she lived in was not kind to women like her. Women without money, without power, without a place to land. I also know that she's not the only one. There are countless cases, some known, some forgotten, where women were harmed, discarded, and misrepresented, where their names became shorthand for tragedy instead of symbols of humanity. And the way we tell those stories matters. So here's how I want to end this one. Not with a theory, not with a list of suspects, not with some dramatic music cue. I want to end with her. I want you to imagine Elizabeth as she really was, sitting in a diner with her hands around a cup of coffee, laughing too loudly at someone's joke, wearing that black dress because she thought it made her look like a movie star, writing a letter to a soldier overseas, telling him he mattered, walking down a California street with her curls pinned just right, hoping, truly hoping, that her life was about to change. She didn't know how close the danger was. She didn't know that her name would outlive her, that people she never met would analyze her every move, that strangers would claim to know her, that her body would be found in a place so empty and yet so public. She didn't know that justice would never come. And yet, she matters. She still matters. We tell her story not because of how she died, but because of what she should have had. A chance, a future, a soft place to land. So if this story stays with you tonight, I hope it stays not because it's shocking, but because it's human. Because it reminds you that behind every crime, there's a person, a soul, a life worth remembering. Elizabeth Short was a person. And even though we may never know who killed her, we can choose what we remember about her. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping make this a space where victims are honored and stories are told with heart. If you have theories, thoughts, or memories, I invite you to share them in the comments, but do it with kindness, with care, with the understanding that this case, like many, isn't about entertainment, it's about justice, even if it never arrives. I'm Mrs. Detective, and I'll see you in the next case.